Nat Turner was born into a world designed to crush both the body and the spirit of enslaved people, a world where freedom was not merely denied, but treated as a dangerous idea. Early 19th century Virginia was one of the most powerful slaveholding regions in the United States, economically dependent on plantation agriculture and socially structured around racial domination. Slavery was not just an institution, it was the foundation of daily life, law, religion, and culture for those born into bondage. Existence was defined by forced labor, constant surveillance, physical punishment, and the ever-present threat of family separation. This was the environment that shaped Nat Turner long before he ever became a symbol of terror in the white South. Virginia's plantations were places of relentless labor. Enslaved men, women, and children worked from before sunrise until after sunset, particularly during planting and harvest seasons. Tobacco, the backbone of Virginia's economy, required exhausting manual labor. Enslaved workers cleared land, planted crops, hoed fields, harvested leaves, and cured tobacco under the supervision of overseers who enforced discipline with whips, clubs, and guns. Any sign of resistance, working too slowly, speaking out of turn, or attempting to escape was met with severe punishment. Violence was not an exception, but a routine method of control. Beatings, mutilations, and public whippings were used not only to punish individuals, but to terrorize others into obedience. Enslaved families lived in constant fear of separation. Husbands and wives could be sold to different owners without warning. Children could be taken from their parents and sold south to harsher plantations. These sales were often carried out to pay debts or as punishment, with no regard for emotional bonds. Mothers lived with the daily anxiety that their children might disappear at any moment. Fathers knew they had no legal authority to protect their families. This destruction of family life was a deliberate strategy to weaken resistance and reinforce the idea that enslaved people had no rights over their own lives. Education was largely forbidden for enslaved people, especially reading and writing. Slaveholders understood that knowledge was power, and power was dangerous. Laws and informal rules prohibited teaching enslaved people to read, particularly religious or political texts that might inspire ideas of equality or rebellion. Despite this, some enslaved individuals learned secretly, often taught by other enslaved people, sympathetic whites, or through careful observation. Literacy was an act of quiet resistance, one that carried severe consequences if discovered. It was within this hostile environment that Nat Turner displayed unusual intellectual curiosity and mental sharpness. From an early age, Turner was noticed for his intelligence. According to accounts later recorded, he learned to read at a young age, a rare and alarming skill for an enslaved child. His ability to read the Bible in particular set him apart. In a society where enslaved people were often depicted as intellectually inferior to justify their oppression, Turner's intelligence challenged that narrative. Some white observers interpreted his abilities as proof that he was different, while others saw him as dangerous. For Turner himself, literacy became a gateway to spiritual reflection and a deeper understanding of the religious language used by both slaveholders and enslaved people. Religion played a central role in plantation life, but it was a deeply conflicted and often manipulative force. Slaveholders encouraged a version of Christianity that emphasized obedience, submission, and acceptance of suffering. Enslaved people were taught sermons that focused on passages instructing servants to obey their masters, while messages of liberation and justice were downplayed or ignored. However, enslaved communities often developed their own religious interpretations, blending African spiritual traditions with Christian teachings. In secret gatherings, sometimes held at night in woods or cabins, enslaved people prayed, sang spirituals, and spoke of a God who heard their suffering and promised deliverance. Nat Turner absorbed religion in a way that was both intense and personal. From childhood, he was described as deeply spiritual, often withdrawn, contemplative, and focused on prayer. He believed himself to be marked by God for a special purpose. In a world where enslaved people were stripped of identity and dignity, religion offered Turner a sense of meaning and destiny. While others may have turned to faith for comfort, Turner turned to it for explanation and direction. The Bible, with its stories of prophets, divine judgment, and liberation from bondage, resonated deeply with him. Turner's upbringing occurred during a time of growing tension in the United States over slavery. Although Virginia was a slave state, debates about abolition were becoming louder in the North, and stories of resistance circulated quietly among enslaved communities. Earlier rebellions, such as Gabriel Prosser's failed uprising in 1800, were remembered with both fear and admiration. Slaveholders constantly worried about insurrection, enforcing curfews, organizing patrols, and restricting movement. Enslaved people needed passes to travel, even for short distances. Nighttime gatherings were viewed with suspicion. The entire social order was maintained through fear. Fear among the enslaved of punishment, and fear among whites of revolt. Despite this atmosphere, Turner was sometimes allowed a degree of mobility unusual for an enslaved person. He was hired out to different owners and allowed to preach to other enslaved people, particularly during religious gatherings. This gave him access to multiple plantations and exposure to the shared suffering of enslaved communities across the region. He listened to their stories, observed their wounds, and absorbed their despair. What he saw confirmed his belief that slavery was not just a social injustice, but a moral crime deserving divine punishment. Turner's personality was shaped by isolation as much as by community. Though respected for his religious knowledge, he was also seen as different, even among the enslaved. His intensity, frequent fasting, and belief in visions set him apart. In a world where survival often depended on silence and compliance, Turner's inward focus and spiritual certainty made him an anomaly. This isolation may have deepened his conviction that he alone understood God's will, reinforcing a sense of personal mission that would later drive his actions. The legal system of Virginia reinforced the total powerlessness of enslaved people. They could not testify against white people in court, could not legally marry, and had no protection from abuse. Killing an enslaved person was rarely punished severely, especially if the owner claimed discipline was necessary. Enslaved people were property under the law, valued only for their labor and market price. This dehumanization was constant and absolute. For someone like Turner, who believed deeply in moral order and divine justice, the contradiction between Christian teachings and the reality of slavery was impossible to ignore. Turner's early life was also marked by exposure to violence. He witnessed whippings, heard screams, and saw bodies scarred by years of abuse. Violence was normalized, embedded into daily routines. Children grew up watching adults beaten, learning early that survival required obedience. Yet this same violence planted seeds of rage and resentment. For Turner, these experiences did not fade into acceptance. Instead, they accumulated into a moral reckoning. Each act of cruelty reinforced his belief that the system itself was evil and doomed to be destroyed. The natural environment of rural Virginia also shaped Turner's worldview. Fields, forests, rivers, and skies were not just backdrops to labor. They were symbols he interpreted spiritually. He believed signs from nature, eclipses, unusual weather, changes in light, were messages from God. In a society where enslaved people had little control over their physical world, interpreting nature as divine communication offered a sense of agency and understanding. Turner's belief that God spoke through signs was not unusual among enslaved communities, but his certainty and literal interpretation were extreme. By the time Turner reached adulthood, he had fully internalized the contradictions of his world. He lived in a society that claimed to follow Christian morality while practicing systematic cruelty. He saw intelligence punished, obedience exploited, and faith manipulated. His identity as an enslaved man collided with his belief that he was chosen by God. This tension created a psychological pressure that could not be resolved through passive acceptance. The world Nat Turner was born into left little room for hope within the system itself. Section 1 of Nat T. Turner's story is not about rebellion yet. It is about formation. It is about how an environment built on oppression, violence, fear, and hypocrisy shaped a man who would later be seen as a monster by some and a symbol of resistance by others. Turner did not emerge from nowhere. He was a product of Virginia's slave society, molded by its brutality and contradictions. Understanding this world is essential to understanding how an enslaved man came to believe that mass violence was not only justified, but divinely ordained. As Nat Turner moved from childhood into early adulthood, the forces that shaped his inner world became increasingly intense and focused, especially his relationship with religion and his belief that he was guided by divine purpose. Faith was not simply a source of comfort for Turner, it became the central framework through which he understood reality itself. In a society that denied him control over his body, labor, and future, religion offered him a realm where meaning, authority, and destiny still existed. Turner's mind turned inward, searching scripture and signs for explanations that the external world refused to provide. Over time, this inward journey transformed into a conviction that he was chosen for a specific and extraordinary mission. Turner's religious development must be understood within the broader context of enslaved spirituality. Christianity was imposed on enslaved people by slaveholders, but it was never absorbed passively. Enslaved communities reinterpreted biblical stories through the lens of their own suffering. The story of Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage, the cries of the oppressed in the Psalms, and the promise of divine judgment against wicked rulers carried profound meaning. For many enslaved people, these stories symbolized hope for eventual freedom, whether in this life or the next. Turner absorbed these narrati deeply, but unlike many others, he did not view them as metaphorical or distant. He believed they were literal, immediate, and directed at him personally. From an early age, Turner believed that God communicated with him directly. He described experiencing visions and revelations that he interpreted as divine messages. These experiences reinforced his sense of being set apart from others. In a world where enslaved people were told they were insignificant, Turner believed the opposite, that he was central to a divine plan. This belief gave his life coherence and purpose, but it also isolated him. His sense of spiritual election meant that he trusted his own interpretations above the opinions of others, including fellow enslaved people who might have urged caution or patience. Turner's literacy played a crucial role in shaping his religious worldview. Being able to read the Bible allowed him to engage directly with Scripture rather than relying on interpretations filtered through white preachers or overseers. He read stories of prophets who were called by God to deliver messages of judgment, often through violence. Figures such as Elijah, Jeremiah, and the angels of Revelation left a strong impression on him. These were not gentle figures advocating compromise, they were instruments of divine wrath. Turner saw parallels between their missions and his own circumstances, reinforcing his belief that God used chosen individuals to bring justice through dramatic and destructive acts. The contradictions between Christian teachings and the reality of slavery weighed heavily on Turner's mind. Slaveholders claimed moral authority while committing acts of cruelty that directly contradicted the values of mercy, justice, and love preached in Scripture. Turner did not interpret this hypocrisy as a failure of individuals alone, but as evidence that the entire system was morally corrupt. In his view, slavery was not merely unjust, it was a sin that cried out for punishment. This belief transformed his understanding of violence. What others might see as murder or rebellion, Turner came to see as divine judgment. Turner's faith was not static, it evolved through intense periods of contemplation, fasting, and withdrawal from ordinary life. He often isolated himself, spending long hours in prayer and reflection. During these periods, he reported experiencing signs that he believed confirmed his mission. Natural phenomena such as solar eclipses, changes in weather, or unusual patterns in the sky took on symbolic meaning. For Turner, these were not random events but deliberate signals from God, marking the unfolding of a divine timeline. Each sign reinforced his certainty and reduced any lingering doubt. This certainty was both empowering and dangerous. It gave Turner the courage to imagine resistance in a world designed to suppress it, but it also narrowed his moral framework. Once he accepted that his actions were divinely ordained, ordinary ethical constraints lost their power. The suffering of innocent people, including women and children, could be reinterpreted as collateral within a larger divine plan. This mindset did not emerge overnight. It developed gradually as Turner's faith became increasingly absolutist. His God was not a distant comforter, but an active judge demanding obedience. Turner's role as a preacher among enslaved communities further reinforced his sense of authority. He was often invited to speak at religious gatherings, where his knowledge of scripture and intense delivery made a strong impression. These gatherings allowed Turner to articulate his beliefs and observe their impact on others. He spoke of judgment, signs, and liberation, themes that resonated deeply with people who lived under constant oppression. While many listeners may have interpreted his words as symbolic or spiritual, Turner himself believed them literally. Each sermon became both a test and a confirmation of his calling. The response Turner received from others likely strengthened his convictions. Being listened to, respected, and sometimes feared gave him a sense of legitimacy. In a society that denied enslaved people authority, religious leadership offered a rare space where Turner could exercise influence. This influence was not merely social, it was spiritual, and therefore, in Turner's mind, sanctioned by God. The more people listened to him, the more convinced he became that he was meant to lead them into action, not just reflection. At the same time, Turner struggled with moments of hesitation and delay. He believed he was chosen, yet years passed without decisive action. During this period, he interpreted his inaction as disobedience or a failure to fully understand God's timing. This internal conflict created psychological pressure. Each new vision or sign intensified his sense of urgency. Turner began to believe that delay itself was sinful, that failure to act would bring divine punishment not only upon himself, but upon those he was meant to lead. The social environment around Turner further fueled his radicalization. He witnessed ongoing brutality, heard stories of abuse, and saw families torn apart. These experiences were filtered through his religious framework, transforming anger and grief into righteous indignation. He did not see suffering as random or meaningless. He saw it as evidence that the time for judgment was approaching. The longer slavery continued, the more certain he became that God intended to destroy it through violence rather than reform. Turner's belief system also drew strength from the absence of legitimate avenues for change. Enslaved people had no legal means to challenge their condition. Peaceful resistance offered little hope of success. In this context, Turner's visions provided an alternative logic. If human systems were closed, divine intervention was the only remaining path. Turner came to see himself as the instrument of that intervention. This belief removed fear of consequences. Death, imprisonment, or suffering lost their power to deter someone who believed he was acting on God's command. As Turner's faith hardened into certainty, his understanding of himself shifted. He no longer saw himself merely as a victim of slavery or a preacher offering spiritual guidance. He saw himself as a prophet in the biblical sense, chosen to enact God's will on earth. This identity reshaped his moral compass. Actions were no longer judged by their human consequences, but by their perceived alignment with divine instruction. Obedience to God became the highest virtue, overriding compassion, caution, and doubt. The transformation of Turner's faith into a revolutionary ideology was not inevitable, but it was deeply rooted in his circumstances. His intelligence allowed him to engage deeply with Scripture, his isolation intensified his inward focus, and the brutality of slavery gave his visions emotional fuel. Each element reinforced the others, creating a closed system of belief that grew increasingly resistant to challenge. By the time Turner fully embraced the idea of violent uprising, it was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of years of spiritual interpretation and psychological conditioning. Section 2 of Nat Turner's story is therefore about the birth of a revolutionary mind, shaped not by political theory or external leadership, but by an intensely personal and uncompromising religious vision. Turner did not see himself as a rebel seeking power or revenge. He saw himself as a servant of God, carrying out a task that others were too fearful or blind to accept. This belief gave him clarity and resolve, but it also set him on a path that would lead to extraordinary violence. Understanding this phase of Turner's life is essential to understanding how faith, when fused with oppression and certainty, can become a force capable of reshaping history through terror and bloodshed. The moment Nat Turner chose to act, years of inward belief and private conviction spilled suddenly into the physical world with devastating speed. What had existed for so long as visions, scripture, and spiritual certainty transformed into organized violence that unfolded across Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831. The rebellion did not emerge as a chaotic outburst, but as a grimly purposeful campaign shaped by Turner's religious logic and the brutal realities of plantation life. Once it began, it moved rapidly, leaving shock, fear, and death in its wake and permanently altering the psychological landscape of the American South. Turner believed the timing of the uprising had been determined by divine signs rather than human strategy. An eclipse earlier in the year, and atmospheric changes that Turner interpreted as supernatural signals, convinced him that God's appointed hour had arrived. For Turner, delay was no longer an option. He gathered a small group of trusted men, enslaved individuals who shared his suffering and, to varying degrees, his belief in the righteousness of violent action. These men were not professional soldiers, nor were they trained revolutionaries. They were field hands, laborers and craftsmen who lived under constant threat and deprivation. What united them was not ideology in the modern sense, but desperation, rage, and the hope that something, anything, could break the chains that defined their lives. The rebellion began quietly under cover of night at the plantation where Turner himself was enslaved. Silence was essential. Firearms were scarce and risky, so the group relied on knives, axes, clubs, and other tools that could kill without alerting neighboring plantations too quickly. Their first victims were members of the slaveholding family who slept unaware of what was unfolding. Turner believed that killing entire households was necessary to prevent alarms from being raised. In his mind, this was not cruelty but obedience to divine instruction. The violence was intimate, brutal, and personal, carried out face-to-face in bedrooms and hallways where power had always flowed in only one direction. As the group moved from plantation to plantation, their numbers grew. Some enslaved people joined willingly, driven by years of accumulated anger and despair. Others were coerced or followed out of fear. The rebellion moved swiftly through the countryside, feeding on momentum and confusion. Word spread faster than official warnings could. Families fled, hid, or armed themselves hastily. Plantation owners who had long believed themselves secure in their dominance suddenly found that the system they relied upon for protection could collapse in a single night. The violence was not random. Turner and his followers targeted slaveholding households, symbols of the system that had oppressed them. Men, women, and children were killed, a fact that would later dominate white narratives of the rebellion and amplify its horror for Turner. The inclusion of women and children did not contradict his sense of justice. He viewed the entire slaveholding class as complicit in slavery's sins. This belief reflected the absolutism of his religious worldview, in which divine judgment did not distinguish between degrees of guilt. The result was a level of violence that shocked even those accustomed to brutality. Within approximately 48 hours, an estimated 55 white people had been killed. The rebellion spread across dozens of miles, leaving behind burned buildings, bloodied homes, and a population gripped by terror. Rumors exaggerated the scale of the uprising, with some whites believing that hundreds or even thousands of enslaved people were rising simultaneously across Virginia. Fear traveled faster than facts. Militia units were hastily assembled, armed posses rode through the countryside, and neighboring states prepared for potential unrest. The rebellion had tapped into the deepest anxiety of slaveholding society, the fear that those they oppressed would one day turn the tools of violence back upon them. Despite its initial success, the rebellion was ultimately unsustainable. The rebels lacked firearms, supplies, and a long-term plan for defense or escape. Turner believed that divine guidance would carry them forward, but the reality of organized military response quickly became apparent. Local militias, reinforced by state and federal troops, mobilized with overwhelming force. Armed, trained, and driven by panic as much as rage, these forces hunted down the rebels with relentless efficiency. As resistance grew stronger, cohesion among the rebels weakened. Some fled into the woods, others were captured, and some were killed in skirmishes. Turner himself escaped immediate capture and went into hiding, spending weeks concealed in forests and swamps. His disappearance added to the myth and fear surrounding him. White communities imagined him as an ever-present threat, a ghostly figure capable of striking again at any moment. This fear fueled indiscriminate violence against enslaved people who had no involvement in the rebellion. The retaliation was swift and merciless. Militia members and armed civilians killed hundreds of black people, many of whom had no connection to Turner or the uprising. Lynchings, executions without trial, and summary killings became common. Fear erased distinctions between guilt and innocence. The rebellion, which Turner believed would bring divine justice, instead unleashed a wave of terror that consumed entire communities. Enslaved people were punished not for what they had done, but for what they might do. The logic of collective guilt mirrored the logic Turner himself had applied to slaveholders, creating a cycle of dehumanization that spared no one. For white Southerners, the rebellion shattered illusions of control. Slavery had always relied on violence, but it also depended on the belief that enslaved people were fundamentally passive or loyal. Turner's uprising destroyed that myth. It revealed that beneath forced obedience lay resentment, anger, and the capacity for organized resistance. Plantation owners began to see every enslaved person as a potential enemy, every religious gathering as a possible conspiracy. Trust, already fragile, collapsed almost entirely. The psychological impact of the rebellion extended far beyond Southampton County. News spread across the South and into the North, igniting fierce debates about slavery's future. In the South, fear hardened attitudes. Laws restricting the movement, education, and religious assembly of enslaved people became more severe. Teaching enslaved people to read was further criminalized. Preachers were monitored, and unsupervised religious gatherings were banned. The rebellion convinced many white Southerners that any relaxation of control would lead to catastrophe. In the North, reactions were mixed. Some abolitionists saw the uprising as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and moral bankruptcy. Others were uneasy with the scale of bloodshed and feared it would strengthen pro-slavery arguments. Turner himself became a symbol onto which different groups projected their beliefs, a monster to some, a martyr our freedom fighter to others. The complexity of his actions resisted simple categorization, but the emotional response they provoked was undeniable. For Turner's followers, the rebellion's end brought brutal consequences. Many were executed after hurried trials, while others were sold away or subjected to extreme punishment. Families were torn apart once again, this time under the banner of security rather than discipline. The rebellion that had begun as an assertion of agency ended with an even tighter grip of control over the enslaved population. Yet the memory of those 48 hours could not be erased. It lingered in whispers, stories, and the collective consciousness of both black and white communities. The rebellion also exposed the fragility of a society built on coercion. The speed with which the uprising unfolded demonstrated how quickly suppressed violence could erupt when conditions aligned. Turner's actions forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about the moral and psychological costs of slavery. Even as the South responded with repression, the fear remained. No law, patrol, or punishment could fully eliminate the knowledge that resistance was possible. Section 3 of Nat Turner's story is the point where belief becomes action and consequence replaces vision. The rebellion was not simply an event, but a rupture, tearing open the carefully maintained image of a stable slave society. It revealed how faith, when fused with oppression and certainty, could produce violence on a scale that terrified an entire region. The 48 hours of bloodshed did not end slavery, but they permanently altered how it was understood and defended. Turner's rebellion became a warning, a symbol, and a wound that the South would carry for generations, shaping its laws, fears, and identity long after the bodies were buried and the fields returned to silence. The rebellion collapsed under the weight of overwhelming force. The story of Nat Turner entered a darker, more methodical phase, marked by pursuit, punishment, and spectacle. The violence of the uprising gave way to the violence of retribution, and the machinery of the state moved quickly to reassert control and make an example of those involved. This phase was not only about capturing Turner and his followers, it was about restoring white authority, calming white fear, and reshaping the legal and social order to prevent any future challenge. What followed was a grim demonstration of how power responds when it has been shaken. In the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, panic ruled Southampton County and the surrounding regions. Organized militias and informal posses scoured the countryside day and night, driven by rumor as much as evidence. Armed men stopped black people on roads, searched cabins, and interrogated anyone suspected of involvement. The distinction between rebel and bystander vanished. Fear turned suspicion into justification, and justification into bloodshed. Many enslaved people were killed on the spot, without trial or proof, simply because they were black and present in a region that had dared to rebel. This wave of violence was not sanctioned by formal law, but it was tolerated and even encouraged by authorities who believed terror was the fastest way to restore order. Nat Turner himself evaded capture for weeks. After the rebellion was broken, he hid in the woods, swamps, and makeshift shelters, surviving on scraps and secrecy. His absence fed white anxiety. Stories circulated that he was still organizing, still planning, still capable of striking again. Turner became more frightening in hiding than he had been in action. He was imagined as a figure of pure menace, a symbol of everything slaveholders feared but could not fully control. His continued freedom, however brief, was a psychological wound to a society desperate to prove its dominance. When Turner was finally discovered, weakened and isolated, his capture was treated as a triumph. He was brought out of hiding and placed in jail, where he became the object of intense scrutiny. White authorities wanted more than his body, they wanted his words. They wanted to understand how such a rebellion could happen, and they wanted a narrative that would explain it in ways that preserved their worldview. Turner's mind, his motivations, and his faith became subjects of interrogation and fascination. Turner's trial was swift and heavily symbolic. The outcome was never in doubt. As an enslaved man accused of leading a mass killing of white citizens, he had no realistic chance of acquittal. The legal process served less as a search for justice and more as a public ritual affirming white supremacy and state power. Turner was charged, convicted, and sentenced to death. Yet even in this tightly controlled process, Turner retained a measure of agency through his confession. While imprisoned, Turner gave an account of his life, beliefs, and actions to a white lawyer who recorded and published it. This document, often referred to as his confession, became one of the most important and controversial sources about the rebellion. Through it, Turner explained his religious visions, his sense of divine mission, and his reasoning for the uprising. He did not express regret in the way authorities might have hoped. Instead, he framed his actions as obedience to God's will. This disturbed many white readers more than any expression of rage or bitterness could have. A man who believed he had acted righteously, even in the face of death, challenged the moral certainty of a society that relied on portraying enslaved people as either content or incapable of higher reasoning. E-confession was carefully shaped by those who recorded and published it, and it must be read with caution. White editors had their own agendas, emphasizing Turner's fanaticism to portray the rebellion as an aberration rather than a symptom of systemic injustice. By presenting Turner as a religious extremist, they could avoid confronting the deeper causes of the uprising. Still, even through this lens, Turner's intelligence and conviction were unmistakable. He appeared not as a mindless killer, but as a man who had thought deeply, if dangerously, about his place in the world. Turner's execution was public and deliberate. It was meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. Public executions were a common tool of social control, especially in slave societies. By killing Turner openly, the state sought to demonstrate that rebellion would be met not just with death, but with humiliation and erasure. Turner was hanged, and his body was reportedly mutilated afterward, a final act of symbolic domination meant to strip him of any lingering power or legacy. Even in death, his body was treated as a warning. The punishment extended far beyond Turner himself. His followers were tried, executed, or punished with extreme severity. Some were hanged after brief proceedings, Others were transported or sold away, separating them permanently from their families and communities. These punishments were not calibrated solely to individual guilt. They were designed to send a message to the entire enslaved population. The state sought to demonstrate that collective resistance would result in collective suffering. The broader black community paid the heaviest price. Hundreds of enslaved people who had no involvement in the rebellion were killed in the weeks following it. White mobs, fueled by fear and vengeance, acted with near-total impunity. The law either looked the other way or actively supported these acts through silence and inaction. This violence reinforced the central truth of slavery, that black lives were expendable in the service of white security. The rebellion had challenged white authority. The retaliation reasserted it through terror. In the months that followed, Virginia's lawmakers moved to ensure that such a rebellion could never happen again. New laws were passed to tighten control over enslaved people and free black communities alike. Education was further restricted, making it illegal to teach enslaved people and, in some cases, free black people to read or write. Religious gatherings were closely monitored or banned, unless supervised by white authorities. Black preachers were silenced, restricted, or forced to deliver sermons that emphasized obedience. The state sought to eliminate the very conditions that had allowed Turner's ideas to spread. These legal changes revealed how deeply the rebellion had shaken the foundations of slave society. Slavery had always depended on violence, but it also depended on routine and predictability. Turner's uprising exposed the fragility beneath that surface. Lawmakers responded not with reform, but with repression, choosing control over reflection. Any acknowledgement that slavery itself was the cause of the rebellion would have undermined the entire system. Instead, blame was placed on Turner's religion, his literacy, and his supposed fanaticism. Public discourse in the South hardened dramatically. Conversations about gradual emancipation, which had occasionally surfaced in earlier decades, disappeared almost entirely. Fear drowned out moral debate. To question slavery now seemed dangerous, even treasonous. Turner's rebellion became a cautionary tale used to justify harsher measures and silence dissent. The South closed ranks around slavery, convinced that survival depended on unity and force. In the North, Turner's execution and the subsequent repression were watched closely. Abolitionists cited the events as proof that slavery was incompatible with Christian morality and Republican values. They argued that violence was not an anomaly, but an inevitable result of a system built on coercion. Others, however, recoiled from the bloodshed and worried that resistance would provoke more suffering. Turner's death did not resolve these tensions, it intensified them, embedding his story within the national debate over slavery's future. Turner himself did not live to see the long-term consequences of his actions, but his capture, trial, and execution transformed him from a local rebel into a national symbol. The state intended to erase him, to reduce him to a criminal example, yet the very effort to control his narrative ensured its survival. His words, recorded and circulated, outlived the gallows. His rebellion entered history not as a forgotten disturbance, but as a reference point for fear, resistance, and moral reckoning. Section 4 of Nat Turner's story reveals how power responds when challenged from below. It shows a society more willing to spill innocent blood than to question its own foundations, more eager to punish belief than to confront injustice. Turner's capture and execution did not bring closure. They exposed the limits of repression as a solution. The state succeeded in killing the man, but it could not fully kill the questions he raised. In attempting to restore order through terror, Virginia revealed the profound insecurity at the heart of slavery, an insecurity that no execution could ever truly erase. The final phase of Nat Turner's story unfolds not in the fields of Southampton County or on the gallows, but in memory, interpretation, and consequence. Long after the violence ended and Turner's body was destroyed, the meaning of his actions continued to trouble the American conscience. His rebellion did not vanish with his death. Instead, it settled into the foundations of Southern fear, Northern debate, and the long, unresolved argument over slavery, resistance, and morality. Section 5 is about legacy, how one brief eruption of violence reshaped laws, attitudes, and historical understanding for generations. In the immediate years after the rebellion, the South was transformed by fear. Nat Turner became a symbol not simply of rebellion, but of possibility. For white slaveholders, he represented the terrifying realization that enslaved people were not passive, ignorant, or content, but capable of organization, leadership, and deadly resolve. This fear altered daily life. Slave patrols became more aggressive. Surveillance intensified. Any sign of independence, education, religious enthusiasm, or leadership among enslaved people was treated as a threat. Trust between enslaver and enslaved, already thin, virtually disappeared. The legal consequences of the rebellion were severe and long-lasting. Southern states, especially Virginia, enacted harsher slave codes. Education for enslaved people was further criminalized, and in some cases, even free black people were barred from learning to read or write. Legislators argued that literacy had enabled Turner's religious interpretations and communication, framing education as a weapon rather than a human right. Religious gatherings were restricted or banned, unless supervised by white authorities. Black preachers were silenced, regulated, or replaced by white ministers who emphasized obedience and submission. These laws did not simply respond to Turner. They revealed how fragile the slave system truly was, how easily shaken by the idea of enslaved people thinking, believing, and acting for themselves. The rebellion also hardened the South's ideological defense of enslavement. Before 1831, some Southern politicians had cautiously discussed gradual emancipation or reform, particularly in Virginia. After Turner, those conversations largely disappeared. Slavery was no longer defended merely as an economic necessity, but as a social and moral good that required absolute control. Any criticism of slavery was now portrayed as dangerous, irresponsible, or complicit in violence. Turner's rebellion became a rhetorical weapon used to silence debate, proof, in the eyes of slaveholders, that freedom would bring chaos and bloodshed. At the same time, Turner's actions deeply influenced abolitionist thought in the North. For many abolitionists, the rebellion confirmed what they had long argued, that slavery was inherently violent and that resistance was an inevitable response to oppression. They pointed to the Uprising as evidence that enslaved people were human beings who desired freedom as intensely as anyone else. Yet Turner also created discomfort among abolitionists who favored moral persuasion and nonviolence. The killing of women and children complicated attempts to present enslaved resistance as purely righteous. Turner forced even his sympathizers to confront the disturbing reality that systems built on violence often provoke violent resistance. Nationally, Turner's rebellion intensified sectional tensions. It became part of the growing divide between North and South that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Southern fear of rebellion fed demands for stricter enforcement of slavery, while Northern outrage over repression fueled abolitionist activism. Turner's name appeared in speeches, pamphlets, and debates, often stripped of nuance and reshaped to fit political agendas. He was alternately depicted as a madman, a demon, a martyr, or a warning. Rarely was he allowed to exist as a complex human being shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Within black communities, Turner's legacy was complicated and deeply personal. Some remembered him as a hero who dared to strike back against an inhuman system. Others viewed his actions with ambivalence or fear, recognizing that the rebellion brought devastating consequences for countless innocent people. Yet even where his methods were questioned, the underlying impulse to resist, to refuse total submission, resonated powerfully. Turner became part of a broader tradition of resistance that included figures like Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and later, those who fought slavery through escape, rebellion, and war. Turner's rebellion also influenced how enslaved resistance was remembered and recorded. Southern historians long portrayed enslaved people as largely content, loyal, or incapable of organized rebellion, framing Turner as an exception driven by insanity. This narrative served to justify slavery by minimizing its violence and denying the agency of those it oppressed. For decades, textbooks and public memory echoed this interpretation, marginalizing the voices and experiences of enslaved people themselves. Turner's story was reduced to a footnote or a cautionary tale rather than examined as a window into the realities of slavery. In the 20th century, his story, Cal interpretation began to shift. Scholars, particularly black historians and later social historians, revisited Turner's life with greater attention to context. They emphasized the brutality of slavery, the psychological toll of constant oppression, and the religious traditions that shaped enslaved communities. Turner was no longer dismissed simply as a fanatic. He was analyzed as a product of a violent system that left few avenues for meaningful resistance. This reassessment did not excuse the killing of innocents, but it challenged simplistic moral judgments by placing responsibility not only on Turner, but on the institution that produced him. Turner's legacy also raised enduring ethical questions that remain unresolved. Can violence ever be justified in the pursuit of freedom? Where does moral responsibility lie when oppressed people strike back at an oppressive system? Is it possible to condemn Turner's actions while acknowledging the injustice that motivated them? These questions have no easy answers, and Turner's story resists closure precisely because it forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about power, suffering, and human limits. Culturally, Nat Turner has continued to inspire art, literature, and debate. Writers, poets, and filmmakers have revisited his story, each interpretation reflecting the concerns of its time. Some portray him as a revolutionary prophet, others as a tragic figure consumed by certainty, and still others as a mirror reflecting America's unresolved racial violence. Each retelling reveals as much about the present as it does about the past. Turner's life becomes a lens through which society examines its own values, fears, and contradictions. Turner's rebellion also left a psychological scar on the South that persisted long after slavery itself ended. The fear of black uprising influenced post-Civil War policies, Reconstruct, Ion-era violence, and the development of systems designed to control black populations through segregation, policing, and economic dependence. While these later systems differed from slavery, they were shaped by the same anxiety that Turner had once ignited, the fear of black autonomy. In this way, the legacy of the rebellion extended far beyond its immediate historical moment. For modern readers, Nat Turner's story challenges the temptation to simplify history into heroes and villains. Turner was neither a pure freedom fighter nor a mindless murderer. He was a deeply religious, intelligent, and traumatized man shaped by a world that normalized cruelty and denied humanity. His certainty gave him strength, but it also blinded him to the human cost of his actions. Understanding Turner requires holding multiple truths at once: that slavery was a moral abomination, that resistance was inevitable, and that violence, even when born of injustice, carries consequences that cannot be contained. Section 5 ultimately confronts the enduring power of Turner's rebellion, not because of what it achieved, but because of what it revealed. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of slavery, the fragility of societies built on force, and the dangerous potential of absolute certainty, whether held by oppressors or the oppressed. Turner's actions terrified the South, divided the nation, and unsettled the historical record. They forced America to look, however briefly and uncomfortably, at the reality that domination breeds resistance, and that systems sustained by violence will eventually face violence in return. Nat Turner's legacy is not a conclusion but an ongoing argument. His story continues to demand attention because it refuses to be resolved into comfort or clarity. It sits at the intersection of faith and fury, justice and terror, oppression and agency. In remembering Turner, history does not offer easy lessons or moral simplicity. Instead, it offers a warning that when human beings are denied dignity, voice, and hope, the consequences can shake entire societies, and those consequences will echo long after the blood has dried and the laws have been rewritten.